we're going to start our lesson for tonight. We're going to continue looking at the book of Genesis. And I know in the last session we only covered the first two verses because we spent a lot of time giving you the background information that you need before you actually start the biblical text analysis. The questions that you need to ask: who wrote it, when it was written, who it was written to, who it was written by, what were the cultural influences that they may have been working through and with, what are the other texts that were known that they may have been corresponding to as we go through the creation narrative, what are the things that they might be refuting or rebutting in their account of the creation. These are all questions that must be asked if we're going to be responsible interpreters of the biblical text. So I want to go back through verse 1 and 2 briefly, and that will set us up to continue. My goal is to get through verse 25. I see that you guys are not confident that we will reach our goal, but it's good to set goals either way. Okay? First of all, we need to remember that the first section of Genesis, remember it's divided up in sections, and these sections, other than this first one, are plainly spelled out in that they say these are the generations of, and it will give a generational account of creation in Genesis 2 verse 4, or from there forward it'll give you these are the generations, and it'll give you a genealogy. Okay, in Hebrew it's Eli Toledot, which means these are the begettings or the initial stages of. Okay, so we're going to go through the first section, which doesn't begin that way, but it sets us up for understanding the process of creation and how God chose to reveal the process of creation to us. So we're going to look at verse 1, and I will highlight the Hebrew text, which will highlight the English text as well. I want you to notice that the beginning here is highlighted in red. The reason why that is because I've tagged that with, if you'll look on the other screen, this Bible word study. Anytime we have a Bible word study that we're working on right here, which is Reshit, it will highlight the corresponding English section in our Bible. So that will be helpful as we go through if we do Bible word studies. And what's neat about that is if it appears anywhere else in the passage that we're looking at, it will be highlighted throughout the passage, which will help us count and number certain things in the text, which I believe will be helpful tonight, because the numbers, the idea of numbers, just like in the book of Revelation, I believe is very relevant in the book of Genesis. So let's look at the first word, Bereshit, which literally means at first or at beginning. Bara, created. Again, creation does not create. To create does not mean to create out of nothing, because what we call nothing is not nothing. Okay? Just because we can't see it in the natural world or the terrestrial world does not mean that it does not exist. Okay? So Bereshit bara, at first created Elohim et. I explained that in the last session, what that could mean and what Jesus himself says in the book of Revelation and how that corresponds to the reality of it being the foundation or the basis of the Word of God, because it is the first and the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which God used to give us the Word of God. But throughout the rest of the Hebrew Bible, when we see this, you will see it precede a direct object. Okay, so this will function grammatically as a direct object identifier. Okay, in other words, if we had a sentence that said, I fed the dog is the direct object. Therefore, this would precede dog because it's highlighting the direct object of the sentence. It's just a grammatical functioning thing that we'll see as we go through. It can sometimes also function as the preposition with. And we'll see that as we go through some of the text. Okay, so what did he create? Hashemayim ve'et haaretz. The heavens, which is a dual word. Anytime you hear the "im" ending, it is a dual word. And this is in relation to the heavens. That is, I believe, relative to us as human beings, the atmosphere we live in, the sky, the air we breathe, and then the heavens above the heavens, which would be the second layer of heavens, which I believe is further broken down when you read other Jewish writings into multiple levels as well. Okay, so he created the heavens and the earth. And then we see verse number 2. I want to reemphasize again, verse 1 is a literary introduction to the passage that follows, verse 2 through Genesis 2 and verse 3. Okay, it's basically a summary statement that is telling us what is about to follow in this creation narrative. Most scholars will agree that Genesis 1 through Genesis 2 and verse 3 is a narrative, which means that is the type of genre that it is, and you have to remember that because genre is so important if you're going to interpret the text correctly, because narrative is not highly symbolic like poetry or prophetic or apocalyptic. So this would be rendered on a more literal scale than other types of genre. Okay, and that's worth pointing out. Okay, let's go to the second verse. V'haaretz hayta, and the earth was tohu vavohu, without form and void, or empty, vain, chaotic, just a mess. And we explained in the last session that I believe this is describing the recreation of an earth that had previously existed, which was a prior creation of God. This is not the original creation here. This is obviously God working with pre-existing matter. The earth already exists. It's just in a non-functional state. So we don't want to, this is one thing that you have to understand that's very different from our culture. Think of function as we go through this narrative versus form. Okay? What's important to us in our culture is appearance, the form. But what was important in their culture was the function. Okay? For example, if I had a pen and I showed you a pen and I asked you to describe it in our culture, we would describe it with adjectives. Okay? It's black, it's pointed. We would describe the appearance. But in their culture, in their world, they would describe it as what it was used for. Okay? Purpose. They would have described a pen as an instrument that is used to write with, which essentially what makes it important. Okay? So when we go through this narrative, and I'll highlight a lot of this, think of the function versus the form, okay? Because what we have here is the earth pre-existing. It's flooded. It's covered by water. It's surrounded by darkness. And it is totally out of order. It is not functionable. It is not able to sustain any form of life. It is in a state of destruction, chaos, a wasteland, okay? So v'haaretz hayta tohu vavohu, and the earth was without form and void. And let's move to the second section. V'choshech al panei tehom, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. The word tehom there is an interesting word that I believe is connected to, and in their culture was connected to, the underworld. Or we would connect it in our minds to hell, or Sheol, the grave, the underworld, where those that have departed go. You have to understand something about the way the afterlife functioned prior to Christ. Prior to Christ, everyone who died went to the underworld. Everyone who died, whether you were righteous or not, went to Sheol. It was a holding place for everyone until Christ. When Christ came on the scene and He went into the heart of the earth, Christ Himself went to hell. When He went to hell after the third day, He led captivity captive, and He took the saints that had died in faith leading up to Him. He took them out of hell. They were raised bodily with Him, and then He ascended with them to heaven and presented them to the Father as the first fruits of the resurrection of the dead with Himself. Okay? But the word Tehom is connected to the underworld, the deep, the bottomless pit. And I actually want to detour for just a moment and show you how we can piece this puzzle together by comparing the Hebrew to the Greek. Okay, so we're going to detour for just a moment, and we're going to go to Revelation chapter 20, and we're going to look at this passage here in verse, let's just begin in verse 1. And I saw an angel come down from heaven, having the key of the bottomless pit and a great chain in his hand. This is describing the time just after Christ returns to the earth physically. And he laid hold on the dragon, that old serpent, which is the devil and Satan, and bound him 1,000 years. And verse 3 is the main verse that we want to look at. And cast him into the bottomless pit. The bottomless pit, I'm going to click on it, and you'll see on the other screen that it gives us the Greek word for bottomless pit. It's two words in English, bottomless pit, but in Greek it's one word. That word is abyssos. And I want you to notice here that it says it is the netherworld, the abyss, the deep. Now when we scroll on down and we look at how it was translated from the Hebrew into the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, I want you to notice what word was used 28 out of 35 times that this word, this Greek word, abyssos, was translated from the Hebrew word, the base Hebrew word. Notice that 28 out of 35 times it was the Hebrew word Tehom. Okay, that's very significant, because the bottomless pit, or the abyss, the abyssos, was what we would acknowledge as being what? Hell, right? Satan's bound and he's cast into hell for 1,000 years when Christ returns. And this word correlates to the word in Genesis as Tehom, the deep. So that tells us that the underworld, or hell, had been created prior to God reorganizing earth to sustain life, which tells us the fall of Satan had to have happened before this recreation account, because Jesus Himself says that it was created for Satan and his angels. Right? Okay, now let's go back to verse number 2. It says, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And then the last part of it, V'ruach Elohim, and the wind of God, or the Spirit of God, merachefet, hovered, al panei hamayim, upon the face of the waters. This is the waters that was covering the earth. Based on what we see in the text here, you really could not even see the earth because it was covered by water. Okay, now we're going to jump into our focus for the rest of the night. We're going to begin in verse 3, and we're going to highlight the entire verse here, and we're going to go along. V'yomer Elohim, and God said, Yahi or, v'yahi or. In other words, and said God, Elohim, be, there will be, or, light, v'yahi or. Now, let me explain something about this. When we go back to thinking about function versus form, light here is not what you see studied in metaphysics. Okay? It's not an object. God is not creating object here. Okay? We'll see that darkness is already there, but we're talking about bringing function to chaos. Okay? And how does he do that? I think it's very interesting, the answer to this. How does God begin bringing functionality to a formless and chaotic state of the earth? By the Word. He begins to speak. Okay? And he begins bringing order to the chaos through the Word. So what we're going to see here on day one is God creating the basis for time. So basically, the theme of day number one is God developing this idea that we have of time. Okay? Don't think so much as an object, because obviously God has not created the sun to give light on day one. So what is this light? Okay, and I believe we can answer that here in just a moment. So it says, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. Okay, light is not an object. Light is a period. It would be best translated this way. And God said, let there be a period of light. Okay, again, He's creating the basis for time. And we're going to see that further developed as we read verse number 4. Watch what he says. V'yar Elohim, and God saw et ha'or, the light, ki tov, that it was good. Now watch what he does. V'yavdel Elohim ben ha'or uven ha'choshech. And he divided, God, between the light and between the darkness. Okay? Why would that be important? Because light and darkness are both aspects of what we call time. Okay? So in order for there to be sustainable life on the earth, He has to organize time. And time is organized functionally by a period of light and a period of darkness. All that had existed prior to was a period of darkness. God interjects into this a period of light, and coupled together, a period of light and a period of darkness will bring us to verse 5. Okay? And I highlight the first part of that phrase. V'yikra Elohim la'or yom. Watch what happens here in verse 5. And He called God to the light, or yom, which is day. He calls the period of light day. Okay? Not light itself, because we don't see light moving forward throughout the biblical text, and we don't call it day. Okay? So I want you to understand that He is creating a period of light. Okay? And that's how we need to understand what He's doing here. So He calls to the period of light, and He calls it yom, which is day. Now the word yom, the Hebrew word yom, means day, or daytime is how it should best be understood here. Daytime, But Yom can also represent the 24-hour period of darkness and the period of light, which together form what we call a 24-hour day. Okay, we're going to see that in the rest of this verse. It says, V'lechoshech, and to the darkness, kara, called he, Laila, night. V'yehi erev, v'yehi voker, yom echad. This last part says, and it was evening, erev, v'yehi voker, and it was morning, yom echad, the first day. Okay? Something that's very interesting about the Hebrew language is they don't refer to days with pagan names like we do Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. God simply says day 1 or first day, day 2 or second day, and they just simply number the days because numbers are important to God, and they climax with the 7th day, which is the number of completion. Okay, so God here on day 1 has created the basis for time, day and night, 2 periods of time, and together they form day 1 of creation. Okay, I want to highlight again that this light, period of light, precedes the creation of the sun, which will occur on day 4. We'll see that. So what is this source of light? Okay, what caused this period of illumination or light? I believe the answer is found in a parallel passage that we referred to in the last session, but I think it's worth going back to. John 1 and verse 1, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and we know that this passage is referring to Christ. And without Him was not anything made that was made. In Him was life, and the life, watch this, was the light of men. In order for there to be life on the earth in the recreation, the first thing that had to be established was a period of light. And the light shineth in darkness, the darkness comprehended it not. A let's skip down. Let's just read verse 6. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of the light, that all men through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world, or giveth life to every man that cometh into the world. Okay? So it's showing that Christ, or God Himself, would be the source of light here on day 1 of creation, because we don't see the sun that we as humans relate to as the source of life until day 4. One thing that I want to highlight is day 1 corresponds with day 4. Day 2 corresponds with day 5. Day 3 corresponds with day 6, and we will see that. Okay? Day 1, what did He create? Time. And then we'll see day 2, space, then matter, and then we'll see that He fills each of those with substance, or what we would call material matter, or what form of life would be sustained in those 3 things that He creates in the first 3 days. Okay? So He creates a place in the first 3 days, and then He puts something in that space or those places in the following 3 days. So what we see here is the beginning or the origins of order. God bringing order to the chaos. When He brings order to the chaos, we will see life and something that is very good. Something that I have here in my notes that I want to read. This light on the first day is indicative of the presence of God, both at creation and among His people Israel. Remember, who was this text written to? Israel. right, by Moses. And so a lot of what is written here would be relative to things that they identified with. And light was something that was big to them because they had the pillar of fire or light that led them through the wilderness. Okay, a light that both reveals and conceals the presence of God. The light at creation was the first word. The word that is indistinct from God's personal presence, and the light among His people is a revelation given by means of another intermediary named Moses. Yet in contrast to the incompleteness of Moses, now the true light, Christ being a type of Moses, has come, who is that very same first word, not distinct from God, and who therefore alone can perfectly explain Him. Okay, so you have God existing as the source of light in the first day of creation. You know what's amazing about that? When we go to the final book, Revelation 22 and verse 5, what do we find in the new heavens? And there shall be no night there, and they need no candle, neither light of the sun, for the Lord God giveth them light, or life, because light represents life, and they shall reign forever and ever. Okay, so you see that the light is connected to God's tangible presence. Something else that's worth noting out, all creation, all creative acts of God take place in the light. Okay? No creation occurs until light is created. Okay, let's read on. Verse 6. V'yomer Elohim, and God said, Yehi rakia b'toch hamayim. Basically, let there be an expanse in the midst, b'toch hamayim, in the midst of the waters. Now, we read that and we're like, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. What is he talking about? Now, you understand that it would have been understood that the waters literally have covered the earth going up into the heavens. Okay? And God begins speaking, and He speaks light. But what is He creating here in verse 6 when it says, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters? And to understand that, I think we should pull up the visual that we have. Remember, they understood the earth as coming up out of the water, and they believed that there was an expanse here, and this is the expanse that God is creating, at least in their mind, that would separate the waters that are above in the heavens, above the clouds, above the skies, separate those waters from the waters that the earth was essentially believed to be floating in. Okay? So basically what God's doing here in verse 6 is He is creating this space right here. We would call it in our culture the atmosphere. It is the expanse, the environment that you and I live in as human beings. Okay? And when we read the rest of that verse, it says, V'yehi, and it will be Mavdil bein maim lamaim. Basically, and it will divide between the waters to the waters. So basically, this expanse here separated the waters that the earth was in from the waters that were above the earth. Okay, so it's basically creating the atmosphere and the environment that you and I live in as human beings. Verse 7, V'yas Elohim et rakia, and God made the firmament, or the expanse, the atmosphere, V'yavdel bein hamayim asher mitachat l'rakia, and he divided or separated between the waters that were under the expanse and between the water asher me'al l'rakia, that were above the expanse. Okay, so going back to our diagram here, he is creating this, and this will be what separates the waters above and the waters below. Now, at this point, the waters still cover the earth. Okay, so try to visualize this without the earth appearing at this point, because there is no dry land. There's just water, and in between, sandwiched in between, there is this expanse, which is space or atmosphere. Okay? And the last part of that says, just want to open my textual criticism. Okay, this last part here, v'yehi chen, and it was so, or the word chen is taken from the root word kun, which means it was established, and it was established. Okay, you'll notice that throughout the text there are little letters. It is showing us the textual variance. In places where I feel like it's noteworthy that there's a textual variant, I may point that out, and then we'll go over here and look at our text comparison and do a comparison. But thus far, there's really not a noteworthy example. Okay, so God has created the expanse, which would be the atmosphere that you and I live in as human beings. Now watch what he does in verse 8. V'yikra, and he called Elohim, God, l'rakia, to the expanse. He calls this expanse Shemaim, which we say heaven. Okay, and we know that it would be the heavens that is related to us as human beings. It would be the atmosphere, including the sky that we live in. Basically, the atmosphere that's able to sustain life, okay, naturally. I don't believe this would include space, because space without artificial help can't sustain life, for us as human beings anyway. Okay, when we read the rest of it, V'yehi erev, v'yehi voker, yom sheni. And the evening and the morning were the second day. And I'm surprised that someone hasn't raised their hand thus far and said, how can there be evening and morning without a sunrise? Because again, he was creating time, function versus form. Okay? Period of time on day one. Now what has he created on day two? Space. Time, space, and then we'll see what he develops next. Are y'all with me so far? So the account of Genesis 1 addresses not only the ordering of time, but also the ordering of space. How does he bring order? By speaking his word. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. Dual. Shemaim is heavens, which means it's dual. Means there's two. There is no singular form for heavens. Yep. Heaven, like I think King James translators translate it, he created the heaven and the earth, which is incorrect. There is no singular form for heaven in the Hebrew language. Okay, so this is the second day, or day number 2. And I'm surprised someone hasn't raised their hand by now and said, does day here in this text mean day as we think of day? Because you have a lot of different ideas on creation and evolution and things like that. Could day mean something different than what you and I think of as day, 24-hour period? And the answer literally is yom means day. It means 24-hour period of time. A period of light and a period of darkness, which is a 24-hour period of time, which is a day. The reason why I don't believe this has anything to do with evolution is because this genre is narrative. And narrative is pretty much straightforward. It's not metaphorical. It's not symbolic. It says what it means and means what it says. Okay? So I believe that a day is a day. Now that doesn't negate what we've already shown, that we believe the earth has existed for who knows how long, and the earth prior to recreation here has sustained no telling what forms of life on it. Okay? So again, this narrative was not written to scientists, and we don't have to find compatibility with science and the biblical text, because God did not have science in mind when He gave the biblical text to the audience that it was given to. Science functions on material things, and as we see very clearly, we're not dealing with only material things. We're dealing with functionality. Okay, it doesn't mean that science is not compatible with the reality of what happened in creation. But again, we're looking at two different perspectives, and the text is not addressing science. Okay, let's move on to verse number 9. If we're going to get to verse 25, we're going to have to pick up the pace. V'yomer Elohim yikavu hamayim mitachat hashamayim el makom echad. Do y'all care if I tell you what this is in Hebrew, or do y'all want me to just stick with the English only? English only? Or do you want to know what the text actually says? Moshe didn't write this in English. So we're going to try to explain the Hebrew and English together, okay? V'yomer, and he said, I'll try to do this. I'll try to break down every Hebrew word literally. Okay? This will be painful at times. V'yomer, and he said, Elohim, God. Remember, the verb precedes the subject, and I know we're like, and it took a while for me to get used to it, but that's how it's written. Yikavu hamayim, let there be gathered the waters, mitachat, under, hashamayim, the heavens, el makom echad, to, makom, place, echad, one place. Okay? Another thing that you'll find in Hebrew is the adjective is in a different order than in English. In other words, in English we say the blue dog, but in Hebrew it's the dog blue. Okay? The adjective is after the object that it is describing. Okay? So God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered to one place. Now, here's an example that I want to point out. If you'll see this A here, that it says that there are textual variants that would say that this word makom should be the Hebrew word mikveh. Mikveh. I'll try to explain this to you, and you may not, it's obvious to me, but I'm immersed in this every day. See how this is spelt? Makom. I know you don't know Hebrew, but look at Mem, Kuf, Vav, and a final Mem. Okay? Now, when I go over this, notice that the last letter, looking at the top right corner, everything is the same except for the final letter if you're reading from right to left. It's the letter He instead of the letter Mem, which changes the meaning a little bit, but not theologically. It's not a big deal. In other words, what it's saying is the alternate textual variants that are out there says, let the waters under the heavens be gathered into one gathering place. What's interesting is the Greek word that is being used here is the Greek word that we get the word synagogue, gathering place. Okay? That's just an example of textual variants that exist. So when someone tells you that there is a single Bible out there that is totally without error, that is just absolute absurdity. There is not. Textually, grammatically, there is no perfectly preserved Bible out there. Okay? From someone who can read it in the languages it was written and do the comparison, it just does not exist. That's why when people get this King James theory and they think that the King James Bible just fell out of the sky, I'm not even going to answer that. I don't even want to talk about it. I'm not even going to go there. Because if you believe that, I really don't know what to say. That's just absurd. Okay? So that's my rant for today. Now we can move on. Let's read the rest of that verse. V'tera'eh hayabashah, and there appeared dry land, v'yehi chen, and it was established, or it was so. Okay? So what do we have being created here in verse 9? Dry land. So does creation mean something out of nothing? No. Because the earth was already in existence. It was just in a non-functional state. God speaks. He brings light, which is life. He brings space. And then He brings dry land forth. It's already existing. He's just calling it forth. So He's created in day 1 through day 3, time, space, and dry land, which is the earth. Okay? All of those which will be necessary to sustain life. And in the preceding days, we'll see that He fills all 3 of those categories with life forms. Okay? That will be involved in each of those. Okay, verse 10. V'yikra, and he called Elohim, God, L'yabashah, Eretz, to the dry land, Eretz. So He called the dry land earth. The next part of this, Ulamikveh Hamaim, and to the gathering of the waters, Kara Yamim, He called seas, Yamim, which is plural. And then it says at the end of this, V'yar Elohim ki tov, and saw God that ki, it was tov, good. Now, what we have just read totally debunks Gnosticism. Anybody know what Gnosticism is? Gnosticism taught that the material world was inherently evil. Anything that was material was evil. That was taught. That teaching arose during the time right around the early church, that everything that was material was evil. But we can see very clearly here in the creation account that we're dealing with material things and God's calling them good. So if everything that's material is evil, then you are essentially arguing with God. Because He said when He created it, it was good. It was functional. It was ready to sustain what it was created for. Okay, so Gnosticism is not scripturally supported, and not everything that is material is inherently evil. Quite the opposite. Now, I do believe that the fall brought an element of evil to the material world, but that's not how it originated. Okay? Now, let's read verse 11. V'yomer Elohim, and He said, God, Tadshei ha'aretz, everywhere where this letter is why whenever I try to highlight it, it wants to open another passage. Let me see if I can highlight this whole verse here. And He said, God, V'yomer Elohim, Tadshei ha'aretz, basically, let the earth bring forth green substance, which we would call grass, trees, anything that's green. Deshe esev, mazria zera etz peri, osei peri lamino. And the English does a very good job of articulating what it says. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after its kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so. So essentially, God is bringing forth on the dry land the ability to sustain life. Because what do we have to have as human beings to live? Food. And what else produces the air we breathe? Green life. Right? Plants and trees and green life. So basically, He is bringing to the dry land what is needed for the climax of His creation, human beings, to have sustainable life. And that's what He creates here. So this would be the grass, the trees, plant life, shrubs, things like that, that would be needed for us as human beings to sustain life. Okay? Let's go to verse 12. V'totzei ha'aretz deshe esev mazria zera l'minehu. And the earth brought forth grass and herb yielding seed after its kind. And the last part of that, they etz and tree, osei peri, making seed, or its fruit, asher zarovo laminehu. So basically it's saying, and the tree which makes fruit that is after its seed, that's in itself, after its kind. And then the last part, V'yar Elohim ki tov. And God saw that it was good. So again, here we have material matter that God is calling good, which again puts to rest Gnosticism. In verse 13, as the conclusion of the third day, V'yehi Erev, V'yehi Voker, and there was evening, and there was morning. Yom Shlishi was the third day. Now, do you notice something about that statement that kind of is different than how we think of things? It goes from evening to morning. We go from morning to evening. But in creation, it goes from darkness to light. From darkness to light. And as far as how God told the Hebrew people to recognize and organize time or days, their day begins in the evening. Their day begins as the sun goes down. In the evening, that begins their day. So when the sun went down this evening, it actually began Wednesday. Okay? And that's how time works as far as God's concerned. That's how He established it. That's why there's a lot of different interpretations of the events that unfold in the gospel narratives in the life of Christ, because of a misunderstanding of how time works and how days work from a Hebraic perspective. Okay, verse 14. I'm afraid we're not going to make it to verse 25. Okay, let's look at this first highlighted portion. V'yomer Elohim, and God said, you guys should have that down by now. V'yomer Elohim, and God said, because it's the whole theme of the creation account. God is speaking, and it's happening. Yehi me'orot birkia shemaim. You guys should actually have a few of these words down. What is shemaim? Come on. Heavens. Right? Okay. V'yomer Elohim yehi me'orot birkia shemaim. And God said, there will be lights. Birkia, where's that? Birkia, ba means in. What's the rakia? It says firmament in the English, but what did we explain that it is? The atmosphere, which extends, I believe there's an expanse in layers. There's the rakia that we live in, the atmosphere, and then there's that above us, which we would call space. Okay, so He is creating lights, and He's placing them where? In the expanse that He created when? That He created when? Exactly. Day 2. V'yomer Elohim yehi me'orot, let there be lights. What's interesting here is, what are these lights that He's creating here? When we read the rest of this verse, it'll tell us, but it is particular. The sun and the moon. Let's read the rest of it. Lehavdil, to divide, between, hayom, which means what? The period of daytime, contextually. Uvain, and between, halayla, the period of night. Vehayu leotot, and they will be leotot for signs. So can the moon and the sun be for signs? Absolutely. When we had the series of blood moons that fell on Jewish feast days 2 consecutive years in a row, that's not coincidental, guys. I don't know what they mean, but the ancient people understood a lot of what this stuff would mean, okay? But it says they are for signs, ule moedim, and for what I think the English version here says for seasons. Scratch that, it's not seasons. It's for appointed times. This word here, let me is, let me click on it and it'll pop up over here. Moed, obviously this is in the plural, Moedim, which means appointed times. Where we really see this word pop up a lot in the Torah is feast. This is the word that is used. This is the Hebrew word that they translate into feast. Noticed here on our paragraph that sometimes it is called feast. So when we talk about the feast of the Lord, which would be what? What would the feast of the Lord be? Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits, Pentecost, Feast of Trumpets, Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. All of those are important to God because God literally changed in Exodus 12 when the Israelites would recognize the beginning of the year. Initially, the beginning of the year and creation was believed to have taken place in the fall. Okay? But God introduced a new calendar to the Hebrew people at the time of the Exodus, which centers around these feasts. Now, these feasts are in connection to what? The cycles of the moon. Okay? What is the cycle of a moon? It gives us what? A month. Okay? So these feasts that the Lord introduced, and guys, I could chase that rabbit for a couple hours, they cycled around the moon. Okay? You would either have them falling at a new moon, which means there's no visibility, or a full moon, which would be in the middle of the month. That's why Passover falls on a full moon every year. Okay? That's why you'll notice that sometimes Easter is in March, sometimes it's in April, because they are not setting a day in the year, they are following the cycle of the moon. Okay? And Passover always occurs on a full moon. That's why when you read the gospel accounts, when it says Jesus was hanging on the cross, it says that darkness was upon the earth while he was hanging on the cross. You know what would have been visible in the sky at that time? A full moon. That would have been up during the day. Have you ever been out in the day during certain times of the month and see a full moon up during the daytime? That's exactly what would have been occurring when Jesus was crucified. Picturesquely, it looks like the enemy's prevailing because many times the moon is a symbol of the enemy. Why is that? Because the moon is a light that cannot produce light of its own. Where does the light from the moon come from? It is a reflection of the sun. Satan is a false bearer of light. And so, to everyone surrounding Jesus hanging on the cross, they're like, looky there. The moon is full. Obviously, it's Passover, and it's dark, and they would have seen the moon, and it looks like evil's prevailing to the world. But they didn't know that they were actually helping fulfill God's plan. Okay, so they will be for feast. So the feast of the Lord, which are connected to redemption, happen in conjunction to the moon in particular. And then it goes on to say, Uleyomim, that's the plural of yom, which means days, and for days, veshanim, and years. So the moon establishes months. Okay? The Hebrew word for month, chodesh, in Hebrew, chodesh, which means month, is taken from the root word chadash, which means new. Because when does the month start over? Every month, with the new moon. Okay? And that's why you'll see them use the cycle of the moon a lot throughout the Old Testament. And they will be for years. Veshanim. What light has been given to us to establish the cycle of years? The sun. Okay? The Gregorian calendar that we observe today is a solar calendar only. Okay? That means it is entirely based on the 365 and a quarter days that it takes for a year. Okay? Then you have the Muslims, what they observe is based only on the moon. Okay? But how Israel observed time in their calendar was based on both. It is a lunar solar calendar. Okay? And I could go into explaining how their calendar works and how that they have to add leap months every few years, 7 times every 19 years. That's another story, and I don't want to get sidetracked, but we could. Okay? Let's finish this passage and then we'll field some questions. Verse 15. Vehayu limoot birkia hashemayim, and let them be for lights in the firmament of the heavens. Leha'ir, to cause. This verb here is a causative verb. It means it causes something to be. To cause light, al ha'aretz, upon the earth, v'yehi chen. Okay? So he says, let me make these lights in the firmament of the heaven to give light upon the earth, and it was so. So, which light would give light during the day? The sun. Which one would give light during the night? The moon. What's amazing and interesting about this is he does not use the traditional Hebrew words for sun and moon. And I believe this is deliberate. He simply calls them the greater and the lesser lights. We'll see that in the next verse. And I believe he doesn't call them the sun and the moon, Shemesh and Yareach, because they were worshipped in Canaanite mythology as being gods, and even Egyptian mythology as being gods. What he is trying to highlight in this creation narratives is they are objects that give light, that were created by the one true and living God. They themselves are not gods, and they are not to be worshipped. Okay? So a lot of what we see here in this creation account is a rebuttal to the mythology and the beliefs that the other ancient Near East people had in multiple deities. Do y'all want to finish through verse 19, or do y'all want to start doing questions?
Pastor, go back to verse 12. I thought that Jesus said everything he created was good up until that point, and the fruit tree reproduced its own self with its seed.
I'm not sure I'm following what you're saying.
Well, he created the day and the night. He created everything. He created the herbs, the trees, and everything, and said it was good up until the point that he created the tree, and the tree reproduced itself because it bore its own fruit.
Okay, which tree are you referring to? Are you talking about trees in general, or
Like fruit trees, basically.
everything that God created that was green had the ability to reproduce after its kind? So in other words, an apple tree grows apples that have seeds in the apples, and when those apples fall to the ground, those seeds are planted in the ground, and what happens? It produces after its kind, another apple tree grows. That's why we see a lot of genetically modified stuff in the world we live in, which is really contrary to God's design. Okay? So, let's move on, verse number 16. My highlighting here is not being cooperative tonight. V'ya'as Elohim et shnei hame'ot hagadolim, and God made two great lights. Et ha'ma'or hagadol lememshelet hayom, the greater light to rule the day, v'et ha'ma'or hakaton lememshelet halayla, and the lesser light to rule the night. Man, there's a lot of spiritual symbolism that you see in other parts of the Bible that we could talk about here, but we'll save that for another time. And then it says, Ve'et hakochavim, and the stars also is how the King James translate it. But the word kochavim is not limited to what we would acknowledge as stars. I mean, when we look up into the heavens, we realize now scientifically that we're not just looking at stars, we're looking at other planets and other objects that are other lighted objects in the sky. So it would be basically other objects that are in the sky that light the sky at night. God allowed them to be visible. Verse 17. V'yiten otam Elohim birkia hashemayim, and God set them in the expanse of the heavens to cause there to be light upon the earth. In verse 18, elaborates on that and says, V'limshol b'yom uvalayla, and literally to rule in the day and in the night, Ulehavdil bein ha'or uvein ha'choshech, to divide or separate between the light and between the darkness, or period of light and period of darkness. V'yar Elohim ki tov, and God saw that it was good. So basically the sun would rule in the day and the moon would rule in the night, and they would divide periods of darkness and periods of light. And verse 19 ends the fourth day, V'yehi erev, v'yehi voker, yom revi'i. And it was evening and morning were the fourth day. And that's where we're going to stop for tonight. As we stop, though, in making it through the first 4 days, let me see if I can find something that is interesting, having read much of this. Okay, Genesis 1 through Genesis 2 and verse 3 is the origins of the world. Chapter 2 through 11, origins of the nations. Chapter 12 through 50, origins of Israel. I want to point out some things that I see in the World Biblical Commentary that are noteworthy, that are in relation to this first section, Genesis 1:1 through Genesis 2 and verse 3. It says the correspondence of the first paragraph, 1:1 and verse 2, with chapter 2, verse 1 through 3, is underlined by the number of Hebrew words in both being multiples of 7. I think this is fascinating. Verse 1 consists of 7 words. We've seen that in the last session. Verse 2 has 14 words. Now, this is talking Hebrew, not English, okay, because it wasn't written in English. And then when you look at chapter 2, verse 1 and 3, which is kind of summary of this, you have 35 words, which is a multiplication of 7. The number 7 dominates this opening chapter in a strange way, not only in the number of words in a particular section, but in the number of times a specific word or phrase recurs. For example, God is mentioned 35 times in this section. Earth 21 times, heaven, firmament 21 times, while the phrase "it was so and God saw that it was good" occurs 7 times. So you have this multiple of 7 all through this first section of the creation narrative, which is very ironic that you find that number existing in Revelation as well. Now here's what we were saying about the correspondence of day 1 and 4, 2 and 5, and 3 and 6. Day 1, light was established, period of light. And day 4, you had forms of light that would rule, the luminaries, the sun and the moon, and the celestial bodies in the heavens. Then day 2, sky or space was created, and we'll see as we move forward in day 5 that he fills that with the birds and the fish. Remember, how did he create space? By separating the waters. And what does he fill in those spaces? Life. Day 3, land is created. And day 6, animals, mammals, and man are established. Okay? So we will see that as we move forward. Okay. I'm going to give you the opportunity to ask questions. The only thing I ask is that you ask questions that are related to the content that we've covered so far. Any questions? Either your brain hurts or have explained thoroughly. Trust me, guys, I leave a lot out when we do these because I don't want to be overly exhaustive, because you would leave here very exhausted. Plus, there's a lot of technical stuff that we would cover that would just bore you to death. But it's stuff that makes the text come alive. So, any questions?
When you speak of Yom, can you break down how we know the fact that it's 24 hours?
He asked about the word Yom, the Hebrew word Yom, which means day, and how that we can come to the understanding that that would mean a 24-hour period of time like we would accept here in the text. And the answer to that is simply to understand how the word functions in Hebrew syntax, which is sentence structure, how it functions contextually throughout the Old Testament in the Hebrew language. And outside of a few different types of genre, the word Yom always, and basically I could pull up this word and we could literally click on this word. This is the Hebrew word, which means day, 24-hour period of time, or it means daytime, the period of light within the 24-hour period of time. And we could literally go through here. It would take us a while. Do you guys see why? Because this word occurs almost 2,300 times in the Hebrew Bible. Now, this is something that I have done in Bible word studies, and I used to do it back before I had computer software. I did it with a book, believe it or not. But I would do word studies on particular words, and I would go and read the word every single time it was in the Bible, and I would read the context around that word. The context is how we determine what the meaning of the word is. Okay? Context is king in interpretation. That and the reality of the genre. This is narrative. This is not poetic. This is not apocalyptic. This is not prophetic. This is a narrative. This is telling a story of the creation. If it was a different type of genre, I would consider that Yom would alternatively mean something else. And if it didn't have after every day and the evening and the morning were the first day, which is 2 periods that are confined into a 24-hour period of time, then I would consider that Yom could mean something else. but from just a background of knowing the Hebrew language and how this word functions in Hebrew sentences contextually and according to genre, I just don't see it meaning something else from what I've understood so far anyway.
Was this like a dead planet and he brought it back to life and recreated it to, I'm not saying like.
Yes, what we see here is a planet that is in ruins, that is covered by water, is non-functional, and God, through His Word, reorganizes it and brings order to the chaos so that it can sustain life. And He done it with the Word, which I believe says something very clearly from the beginning pages of the book of Genesis. The answer to life is the Word. That's why Jesus is the Word, because He is the answer. Any other questions?
So every time we see the word heaven, it really should be heavens.
Yes, every time you see the word heaven, it should be heavens. A lot of the newer English translations are accurate in putting heavens, but like your King James Bible and some of the older versions put heaven, and that is not accurate. It just is grammatically impossible to mean that. There's a lot of things, guys, that are not debatable. When you get into the grammar of the language, I mean, that's where you can get into making concrete assertions about certain things. For example, heavens is plural, period. There's no, I mean, it's dual. There's no other way around it. It's just the way it is grammatically, and it doesn't change. Anybody else? Where'd all the water go? I believe that God brought the earth up out of the water. That is a good question. Where did the water go?
I know we still have, underground streams and all that, and we still have cracks in the earth, and, the tectonic plates and things of that nature, and the water still comes up through that. But a lot of underground water still.
Yeah. Obviously, a lot of the water has been pushed into what we would call seas and oceans. And then in their mind, they thought that some of the water was pushed up into the heavens, and it just fell through portals of the heaven, which we know now scientifically that rain comes from clouds. But in their mind, they viewed up above in the heavens as almost material-like. So, I don't know. God spoke to the water and it got out of the way. That's all I know.
That's entirely possible. But with the Great Flood and all of those things, there are scientific reasons as to why that happened and how it happened. So I'm just wondering if there's anything to tie
Mm-hmm.
if it was in fact, tectonic plates coming together, rising up in the land, as you say, he brought the land up from the water, or if there was anything that pointed to how that happened.
I believe that if we were able to understand in full scientifically what took place in creation, I don't think that what scientists would call natural law would be apart from the activity that happened in creation. I believe that very much could be a part of what took place. But being able to explain that, and me not being a scientist and knowing anything about natural law, that's over my head.
So do you think it looks like the Pangea theory before it all broke apart?
Yes. The Pangea See, that this is a perfect example where science is wrong, unless you're willing to accept that the Bible is not accurate. It has been theorized, and science is based on theory because you can't really prove science most of the time. But it's been theorized that the Pangea occurred millions of years ago or whatever. No, it happened at the time of the Tower of Babel. So that shows you how wrong science is in their assumption of trying to date the Pangea event, because the earth was divided at the time of the Tower of Babel. And we'll see that as we move along. And that happened 4,000 years ago. There's a huge difference in 4,000 years and millions of years. We can prove that with the Bible, unless you're willing to say that the Bible is wrong. I'm not that brave. Any other questions? You guys are quiet tonight. Y'all are tired?
Well, how about verse 11? Were those things in the water, or where'd they come from?
Not in first, it was created, right?
11, verse 11, and God said, "Let the earth bring forth grass, and herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth," and it was so. We'll see more about that when we get to chapter number 2. We'll see a lot of parallelism, because Genesis 2 is a retelling of a lot of the same stuff that we see here in chapter 1. So we'll save that for when we get to chapter 2.
If there's so many hybrids or mixed, fruits and trees, and how do we know what's what? I mean, because in the stores, there's so many different, like apples and berries or whatever. I mean, yeah, but we don't know what's what. I mean, we know what's good.
Let's say label it, you don't know.
You don't know.
I think the FDA is pretty much passing laws to where they are forcing people to label GMO products, which I think is good, because I personally try not to eat GMO stuff, because that means it's been messed with man. Anyone else? I got an article sent to me here that says, "Study deep beneath the earth," the deep, the fountains of the deep that you see mentioned as part of the cause of the flood, are more water than in all the oceans combined. So how deep is the deep? Yeah. Okay, the deep, which is the waters, beneath the earth, contain more water than in all the oceans combined. Basically, the waters beneath the earth's surface that you don't see have more water than all the oceans combined that you do see, if you were to measure the amount of water that's in the oceans.
Doesn't it say in the flood of Noah that the earth opened up and the water came out?
Yes, during the flood of Noah, it says the fountains of the deep were broken up. So the water from inside the earth would have been released. And that's why a lot of young earth creationists say that that event of the flood would have caused catastrophic levels of sediment moving and stuff like that, that would explain a lot of the different layers of strata that you see, like in the Grand Canyon and other places, that scientists would say took eons of time to develop those layers of strata, where young earth creationists say no, the event of the flood was such a cosmic happening by the fountains of the deep opening up, earthquakes going on, volcanic eruptions going on that moves this sediment rapidly, and forcefully. And that's why you have layers of strata from like different periods of the earth that are piled on top of each other. And it's like, how did that happen? And that's their explanation. But it's all theory.
Didn't we watch one of those in Faith Life they could go watch? Wasn't that in Faith Life we watched that?
That was one I had purchased and showed for everybody. You can go to Faith Life if you want to see a young earth perspective, which I don't agree with everything in. You can go watch it in Faith Life. You can buy from the Faith Life store. The movie, I think, is $12. We watched it here at the church. I think it's called Genesis. Is Genesis History? Is Genesis History? You can see that movie.
It's on Netflix.
It's on Netflix too. All right.
It's amazing to me how, the very example for our lives in the first chapter of Genesis, and it's kind of that you find this chaotic state through the word, it becomes the very example of what we should have for our lives. It's right there.
Yeah. Two major themes that we find here in Genesis 1. Number one, there is one God and one Creator, not many gods. He is supreme over all and ruler over all, and everything is subject to His Word. And then it highlights the importance of the Word of God, how the Word of God can change chaos and confusion and bring order and structure so that it can sustain life. It sets the precedence for the rest of the Bible, the Word of God. And God said, and God said, and God said. And when He spoke, things changed, and life came forth. And that's the theme of Genesis. Any others? All right.